The world ended once quietly, beautifully, and no one remembered. Beneath a dying sky, the last of an ancient kind held the secret that would ignite everything humanity would become. They were the Neanderthals, guardians of a knowledge carved in bone and sealed in blood, a truth too powerful to survive unchanged. What they left behind was not ruin, but inheritance, the fire in our veins, the memory in our cells. This is the story of how their world ended so ours could begin. Before we start, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who still believes the past can speak, and subscribe so these lost histories live on. Tell us where you're listening from tonight. Let's see how far their memory still travels. Now, take a breath and return with me to the frozen twilight of prehistory, where the last fire flickered and the knowledge humans were never meant to have was born. It began not with language, but with light. The night was a vast and living thing, breathing around the edges of the unknown. Beneath a canopy of stars that had never known a name, a small tribe of Neanderthals gathered around a trembling flame. The fire cracked and danced, its glow reflecting in their eyes like the first mirror of the soul. It was warmth against the cold, protection against the beasts that hunted in shadow, but it was something else too. It moved, it consumed, it lived. In its unpredictable rhythm, they saw not just safety, but power. For hundreds of thousands of years, their kind had endured without such mastery. They followed the herds, slept beneath the wind, and learned from the earth by instinct. But this night was different. The light spoke to them in a language they could not yet name. It revealed color in the dark, motion in stillness, and the fragile distance between life and death. The oldest among them watched the flames bend in the air, sparks spiraling upward like spirits escaping from the earth. For the first time, they reached toward something beyond survival. The fire taught them how to transform the world. It turned raw meat into nourishment, stone into weapon, fear into ritual. Around its glow, the first shadows of story appeared, grunts that carried rhythm, gestures that carried meaning. They began to gather not only to eat, but to remember. The light became their teacher, their god, and their reflection. Every flicker burned a lesson into the mind of a species still learning what it meant to be aware. But knowledge came with a cost. The same flame that gave warmth could devour forests. The same light that guided them could blind them. When lightning no longer fell, when embers died, desperation drove them to guard the secret of flame as if it were life itself. Some believed the fire was a living spirit that must be fed, respected, even feared. It became the first forbidden thing, the beginning of all boundaries between what humans could touch and what they should not. In that glow, the Neanderthals crossed an invisible threshold. They no longer belonged entirely to the wilderness. They had stolen something sacred from it. The night no longer owned them completely, but neither would it forgive them for their theft. And as the sparks rose into the endless sky, they carried with them the first whispers of what would one day be called knowledge, the light that saves and the light that destroys. Long before history began, when language was still a scattered collection of sounds, and the world was a wilderness of ice and fire, the Neanderthals became watchers of the sky. Night after night, beneath the shifting glow of the Milky Way, they lifted their gaze to the heavens. They did not yet have words for stars, for moon, for time itself, but they understood their rhythm. Above the frozen plains of Ice Age Europe, patterns repeated with haunting precision. Moons waxed and waned, constellations drifted across seasons, and the horizon swallowed the sun at predictable points in the year. Somewhere in that vast silence, a question was born. The bones they left behind still bear the marks of that wonder. Tiny notches carved in ivory and reindeer bone, arranged in repeating patterns. Archaeologists call them tallies, calendars, or ritual marks. But they are something more, a primitive conversation with the cosmos. Each groove recorded a phase of the moon, a migration, a memory of when light returned to the cold world. It was knowledge preserved not in books, but in touch, in pattern, in patient observation. To carve the night into bone was to defy its mystery. The Neanderthals did not build cities, but they built meaning. On high plateaus, stone circles, and animal bones were aligned to the path of the rising sun at midwinter. When the darkness was longest, they gathered in those places to wait for the light's return. It was more than ritual. It was recognition that life itself was bound to the rhythm of the sky. In that awareness lay the first seed of science and the first whisper of spirituality. They may not have named the constellations, but they knew them. The great hunter that rose when the mammoth herds returned. The cluster that vanished when the snows melted. The stars were both clock and compass, a map written across eternity. Each glittering point above was a reminder that existence was not random. It followed order, precision, design. And yet, beneath that same sky, they must have felt the same unease we still feel. The awe of knowing just enough to sense how much remains beyond reach. To look upward was to stand at the edge of infinity. The Neanderthals became the first astronomers, the first philosophers, and perhaps the first to understand that knowledge was both illumination and burden. For in watching the stars, they learned the most enduring truth of all, that the universe watches back. Far beneath the frozen surface of the world, the Neanderthals entered the dark. Limestone walls rose like the ribs of the earth, echoing with water and silence. Inside those caverns, away from wind and predator, something began that would outlast their bones. The first artists of the human line lifted their torches and painted the unseen. Not to decorate, but to remember. Not to impress, but to speak across time. The walls of those caves became their memory. Spirals, hands, herds of mammoth and bison, all etched with patience, each mark a fragment of thought preserved in stone. These were not idle images. The same animals they hunted by day became sacred shapes by night, drawn in flickering light that made them appear alive. When the flame moved, so did the herd. When the torch dimmed, the spirits vanished. The cave itself became a living canvas, part ritual, part revelation. To step into that darkness was to cross into another world. The air was heavy, still, ancient. They carried ochre mixed with fat and spit, brushed with fingers and bone tools. In those red and black pigments, they carried the knowledge of cycles, the hunt, the seasons, the birth and return of light. Each stroke was a message left for those who would follow, a way to say we were here, we saw, we understood. The handprints tell the most human story of all. Negative impressions blown with pigment, palms pressed flat against the wall. Generations later, those same shapes remain, their fingers spread, their silence eternal. They are signatures from an age before language, proof that awareness had taken form. Archaeologists find them in Spain and France, painted long before our own species arrived. In those stenciled hands lies an unspoken truth. The Neanderthals were not primitive. They were poets of stone and shadow. These caves were more than shelter. They were sanctuaries of memory, places where sound itself changed. The low hum of a voice could echo for seconds, vibrating through bone and mind alike. Some chambers were chosen for their acoustics, suggesting the presence of rhythm, chant, perhaps even song. To the Neanderthals, the earth spoke, and the caves were where they learned to listen. In those whispering halls, thought became legacy. Each symbol, each mark, each echo was a fragment of a language the world would one day forget. When they sealed their torches and left, the dark closed behind them, keeping their memories safe. And so, the caves became their libraries, their temples, and their warnings, testaments to a mind that sought meaning long before history began. In the beginning, fire was a gift and a threat, wrapped in the same light. For the Neanderthals, It was the closest thing to magic they would ever know. It gave warmth to a freezing world, turned raw flesh into nourishment, and illuminated the endless dark of their caves. Around its glow, life could continue when winter swallowed the sun. Yet even then, they understood something that would haunt every generation that followed. What gives life can also take it away. Archaeological traces tell their story in silence: rings of ash buried deep in Paleolithic soil, charcoal mixed with bone, scorched stones arranged with care. The Neanderthals did not merely find fire. They mastered it. They learned how to tend embers through the night, how to feed the flames with dry moss, bark, and marrow-rich bones. Some fires were tools, others were rituals. They knew that a single spark could harden a spear point, that the heat could shape stone beyond its natural form. They discovered that wounds sealed faster under the touch of smoke and flame, that heat itself could drive out infection. Fire became both medicine and teacher, but every miracle carries its shadow. They began to see the hunger within the flame. A spark carried too far could devour their shelters, consume forests, and leave nothing but ash. They watched lightning strike dry grass and saw fire move as if alive, feeding without mercy, growing without limit. It could warm their children or erase their world in a single breath of wind. The balance between reverence and fear became the foundation of their rituals. Some clans offered bones and fat to the fire before eating, believing it demanded tribute. Others buried coals from their hearths before moving on. A symbolic burial for something sacred that could not be trusted to follow them. At night, the light flickered across their faces, casting shadows that seemed to move with thought. They began to whisper stories of fire that spoke, of flames that punished those who misused them. These were not superstitions of ignorance. They were the first attempts to understand a power greater than themselves. When the fire leapt without their command, when dry wind carried embers through the grass, they watched the earth burn and realized they were no longer its masters. They had created a god that refused to obey. The fire that healed, now destroyed, reminding them that knowledge is never without cost. In its reflection, they saw both the birth of control and the first glimpse of fear, the moment the world revealed that every light casts a shadow. Long before writing, long before myth had words, there was the color red. Across the frozen world of the Neanderthals, this hue appeared again and again, painted on cave walls, pressed into stone tools, and dusted across the bodies of the dead. Red ochre, iron-rich earth ground into powder was more than pigment. It was meaning. It was life made visible. To them, it carried power beyond the reach of speech, a force that connected blood, soil, and spirit into a single truth. Archaeologists have uncovered the traces of this fascination in burial sites older than memory. In shallow graves beneath rock shelters, bones gleam faintly under layers of ochre, as if sleeping in the glow of an eternal sunset. Some bodies were carefully arranged, the pigment covering their faces, hands, and hearts. Others were sprinkled lightly, as though kissed by ritual rather than drenched in ceremony. Each act speaks to an awareness that death was not an end but a crossing, and that the red earth might light the way. The Neanderthals used ochre for more than burial. Mixed with marrow or animal fat, it became paint and medicine, salve and symbol. Some researchers believe it protected their skin from cold and insects. Others see evidence of healing, its iron content acting as primitive antiseptic. Yet the most haunting theory suggests something deeper. In a world where every life depended on the cycles of sun and blood, the color red became the bridge between the living and the beyond. To paint in red was to mimic the pulse of existence itself. Within the caves, the color took on new life. Figures of bison, lions, and mammoths leap across the walls, their forms outlined in crimson. Handprints appear like ghosts reaching through time. Each mark a silent declaration. We were here. We knew. We remembered. Some pigments are so pure they shimmer like embers even today, preserved by the breath of the earth. In their vibrancy lies intent, reverence, perhaps even worship. But what did they believe? Was red a signal to the spirits, a ward against the unknown, or a message to the stars they watched so faithfully? Perhaps it was all of these at once. To dream in red was to dream of power, of survival, of immortality. It was to hold the memory of the hunt, the warmth of the hearth, and the heartbeat of creation itself. For the Neanderthals, red ochre was not just color, it was consciousness made visible. It was the blood of the earth, the first paint of the soul, and the earliest language humanity ever spoke. Before language, there was sound raw, unshaped, unclaimed. The cries of the wind through the trees, the rumble of thunder, the heartbeat of the earth beneath the ice. For the Neanderthals, this was the first music, and from it emerged something extraordinary. Somewhere, deep in prehistory, sound began to change. A cry became a pattern. A hum became a name. The world, once silent except for nature's voice, began to echo with the first human attempt to command it. The Neanderthals were not wordless beasts. Their throats and skulls tell us they could shape sound almost as we do. They called across valleys, imitated bird calls, and chanted within caves that turned whispers into thunder. Slowly, sound became meaning. A call could signal danger. A tone could soothe an infant. A pattern could bind a group together. But in that discovery lay something far greater and far more dangerous. To make meaning from breath was to step into the realm of creation itself. It is here that the forbidden voice was born, the belief that sound itself carried power. Some clans may have believed the right tone could calm the hunt, summon rain, or heal the wounded. Others feared that certain sounds could awaken spirits sleeping beneath the soil. Archaeologists find evidence of rhythmic markings on bone flutes and hollowed stones, instruments that seem less about music than invocation. These were not performances. They were conversations with the unseen. Deep in echoing chambers, where light could not reach, their chants took form. Sound became a tool to shape emotion, to bind fear, to reach for something larger than themselves. The caves amplified their voices until they became one with the earth's heartbeat. To speak was to touch the divine. But that divinity carried a shadow. As their voices grew stronger, so did their fear of what they might awaken. Some sounds were never repeated. Some chants were forbidden. The Neanderthals were learning what all humans eventually do, that creation and destruction share the same breath. A word can comfort, but it can also curse. A sound can call life, or it can call death. And so they began to guard their voices, treating them as sacred tools, not toys. Silence became reverence. In the hush of the ancient world, the Neanderthals learned the oldest truth of all, that to speak is to shape reality, and to misuse that gift is to challenge the balance of nature itself. Long before ink and parchment, before words could be written or remembered, the Neanderthals began to speak to time through stone. Ivory, flint, and bone became their pages, and the world itself their library. Across the scattered plains of Ice Age Europe, archaeologists have found their marks: lines, grooves, and spirals, carved with patient precision. To the untrained eye, they might seem random, the idle scratching of a restless hand. But when studied closely, a pattern emerges, a rhythm, a language without letters. These carvings were not art. They were record. The marks often repeat in cycles that mirror the turning of the moon or the shifting of the seasons. Some appear beside animal bones, as if to track migrations or signal the time of the hunt. Others are carved deep into stone tools, suggesting that memory was meant to travel with the hand that worked it. Through these small etchings, the Neanderthals began to archive the flow of their world. The passing of rivers, the rise of stars, the rhythm of survival. Theirs was not writing as we know it, but it carried the same intent to hold knowledge beyond the limits of a single life. Among the symbols found from Iberia to the Ural Mountains, one stands apart: the spiral. It appears again and again, carved on mammoth ivory, traced in ochre on cave walls, etched onto the smooth bones of hunted beasts, always turning inward, always returning to itself. Some scholars believe it marked the sun's journey through the sky. Others see it as a memory of water, of eddies and whirlpools that shaped their world. But in ancient myth and across distant cultures that followed, the spiral would come to mean something far more profound: the bridge between worlds, the memory of the sky's descent. Legends born long after their extinction whisper of the day the heavens fell, when fire reigned and the air turned to ash. Perhaps the spiral was not just symbol but witness, the mark of those who saw the stars fall and wanted the earth to remember. If that is true, then these carvings are not messages to each other, but to us. Every stroke of stone against stone was an act of defiance against forgetting. The Neanderthals, without language or civilization, reached into eternity and left a trace. The stones remember what they could not say. In their spirals lies the first attempt to capture the motion of time itself, to hold a fleeting world still, if only for a moment, before the sky fell silent again. The world of the Neanderthals was born in ice. Endless winters carved their lives as surely as wind shapes stone. For tens of thousands of years, they endured landscapes where survival itself was an act of genius. The sun was a faint rumor on the horizon, and the night stretched long enough to swallow memory. Yet in this frozen silence, the Neanderthals did not vanish. They adapted. They became the children of the ice. Every fragment of their existence bears witness to that mastery. They crafted clothing from animal hides, sewing with sinew and bone needles so fine they could have been made by modern hands. They built shelters from mammoth bones and packed them with moss and clay, their walls thick enough to hold warmth through a winter that never seemed to end. They learned to track reindeer and bison across blizzards, to read the faintest impressions left in the snow. Theirs was a world of detail and discipline. A single mistake meant death, yet every decision, every tool, every fire, every hunt was a step deeper into understanding the rhythm of the cold. But adaptation is never without consequence. In mastering the elements, they began to change not just their bodies, but their relationship to the wild. They no longer moved only with the seasons, they shaped them. They built fires in places where none had burned before, hunted with cooperation so precise it bordered on orchestration. The ice taught them unity, endurance, and foresight. But it also whispered a dangerous lesson: that nature could be commanded. In their pursuit of survival, they began to forget that they too belonged to the frost. The warmth they created distanced them from the wilderness that had once been their teacher. To conquer the cold was to lose a part of themselves to it. Some believe this was the first step toward separation, the moment when humanity began to see itself not as a child of nature, but as its rival. Yet even as they hardened against the world, the Neanderthals remained bound to it in ways we can only imagine. Their bones carry traces of smoke and pollen, proof of fires and flowers placed together in ritual. They did not simply endure the ice. They found meaning within it. Each frozen dawn was a reminder that survival was not a conquest, but a communion, a fragile harmony between fire and frost. And though they would one day disappear, their mastery of that balance left behind the blueprint of what it means to be human, to endure the impossible, and in doing so, forget how impossible it was. Across the wind-swept plains of prehistoric Europe, long before the age of pyramids or temples, immense stones rose from the earth. They stand even now, weathered and silent, their purpose lost to time. These monoliths, predate every known civilization, and in their mystery lies a question that reaches into the deep past. Who placed them there, and why? Some of the oldest among them appear in layers of earth dated to a time when only Neanderthals roamed these regions. If that is true, then the story of the standing stones begins not with modern humans, but with a vanished people who shaped the landscape itself. Archaeologists have found strange arrangements of stone deep in ancient caves and on open tundra plateaus where no settlements existed. Circles, alignments, and pillars that seem too deliberate to be accidents. At Bruniquel Cave in southern France, broken stalagmites arranged in rings and arcs have been dated to nearly 175,000 years ago, long before our species arrived. The Neanderthals who built them worked in total darkness, carrying fire deep into the cave's depths, placing each stone with precision. It was not shelter, nor defense, nor storage. It was something else entirely, something that speaks to a mind reaching beyond survival into the realm of symbol. The arrangement of those stones suggests intention, rhythm, perhaps even ceremony. Some researchers believe the circular patterns may have held acoustic properties, amplifying sound in certain frequencies. When voices or drums echoed within, they would have vibrated through the stone and the bones of those who stood inside it. To experience that resonance was to feel the earth itself responding a conversation between matter and meaning. The Neanderthals, who lived so closely with the natural world, may have recognized in that vibration something sacred. In a world without writing, sound itself was language, and stone was the first instrument to carry it. Others see in the monoliths a form of territorial marking, a declaration of presence carved into eternity. Unlike wood or bone, stone endures. Perhaps they raised these pillars to remember the dead or to signal sacred ground, places where earth and sky met in balance. Each placement would have demanded immense effort, yet no evidence of beasts of burden or wheels exists. The strength required must have come from many hands, guided by knowledge of leverage, rhythm, and cooperation. To move earth was to defy it, and to do so together was an act of unity as much as will. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The practice vanished, leaving the stones to stand as sentinels of forgotten purpose. No later Neanderthal sites show such scale or structure. The reasons for this silence are unknown. Perhaps climate drove them from the plains, perhaps fear or loss fractured their clans, or perhaps they understood something that made them stop, a realization that what they had built reached too close to the divine. When we look upon those ancient monoliths today, we are staring into a memory carved in stone. The Neanderthals left no written words, yet through those enduring shapes they speak still. They remind us that intelligence is not measured by invention alone, but by the will to give meaning to the world. Their stones were not monuments to power, but to connection, the desire to leave a trace in the vastness of time. And though their voices have long since faded, the earth remembers the vibration of their hands. The stones remain, whispering to the wind, carrying the secret they once knew, that even in silence, matter itself can speak. In the deep silence of the Ice Age, when the world was ruled by wind and memory, the Neanderthals began to listen to voices that were not their own. Theirs was a world of echoes, echoes from within the caves, from the forests, from the past itself. They lived close to death, and in that closeness, they began to sense that the dead were never entirely gone. Long before temples or gods, before the idea of heaven or soul, the first humans may have whispered to shadows, believing the unseen could hear. Evidence of this belief lingers in the soil. In burials older than history, the dead were placed with care, bodies curled as if sleeping, surrounded by tools, flowers, and traces of red ochre. To bury with intention is to acknowledge continuation. It is to admit that life does not end, only changes form. For the Neanderthals, death was not disappearance, but transformation. The fire went out in the body. but its warmth lingered in the air. They felt it in the shifting light, in the silence after a storm, in the flicker of a torch that moved without wind. Something unseen watched them, and they learned to watch back. Within the echoing chambers of their caves, sound itself became sacred. A single voice could fill the darkness and return altered, distorted, as if another being had spoken in reply. To them, this was no trick of acoustics. It was conversation. The earth was alive, its stones and shadows inhabited by memory. To chant within those walls was to awaken the ancient ones, to call upon guidance, protection, or warning. Some researchers believe these experiences marked the beginning of human spirituality. The moment awareness turned inward and found mystery there. In these ancient rituals, the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. Hunters sought strength from those who had fallen. Mothers whispered names to infants, as if calling old souls home. The clan fire became a portal of remembrance, its smoke carrying words into the unseen. Death was not to be feared, but consulted. The wisdom of the dead could guide, heal, or haunt. To speak to shadows was to acknowledge that knowledge itself had a price, that understanding came not only from observation, but from surrendering to what could not be known. Whether this was religion or the birth of consciousness remains uncertain. Perhaps both. For in learning to speak to what was gone, the Neanderthals discovered a new dimension of thought. The ability to imagine, to remember, to wonder. The act of hearing what was not there was the first step toward belief. And belief would one day give rise to civilization. The caves that once held those whispers remain dark and still. But their walls remember. The pigments, the handprints, the bones, they are echoes of that first conversation between life and death. The Neanderthals stood at the edge of mystery and dared to listen. In doing so, they became more than survivors. They became aware. And in the quiet after their voices faded, the shadows kept speaking. Beneath the frozen surface of the ancient world, the earth was alive. Long before humanity learned to name it, the Neanderthals felt the pulse of the planet beneath their feet. They wandered through lands shaped by fire, mountains that smoked, rivers that boiled, and stones that glowed with an inner light. In a world ruled by ice, the discovery of heat from the earth itself must have felt like revelation. This was not the fire of the hearth, fragile and flickering, but something older, something born from the bones of the planet. To encounter it was to stand before the breath of creation. Archaeological traces suggest that Neanderthals lived near regions of geothermal activity. Springs that steamed in the snow. Black volcanic glass scattered like mirrors across the ground. They learned to use what nature offered. Obsidian became one of their sharpest tools, a stone so perfect it could split flesh or hide with a single strike. Yet behind the beauty of that glass lay danger. They saw mountains that burned from within and valleys filled with the scent of sulfur. To them, these were places where the world itself seemed alive, its veins glowing red, its heart beating deep in the dark. Over generations, these encounters shaped their myths. When the mountain trembled, or the sky turned red, they must have sensed purpose behind the chaos. Fire did not simply exist. It spoke. Smoke rising from the earth carried messages from unseen realms. Some caves bear traces of soot high on their ceilings, beyond the reach of torches, as if flames had danced upward on their own. Within those dark chambers, they may have imagined that spirits lived inside the rock, whispering through heat and echo. The world around them was no longer silent. It breathed, it growled, it remembered. Volcanic glass and mineral pigments became sacred objects. Red ochre and black ash were mixed together, perhaps symbolizing the union of earth and fire. They wore these colors not only for beauty, but for protection. To carry the color of the earth's blood was to hold its power. The glow of certain stones, when heated or struck, would have seemed a live proof that even cold rock could awaken under the right touch. The Neanderthals may not have known geology, but they understood wonder, and that understanding was the beginning of myth. In the rhythm of eruptions and earthquakes, they recognized a pattern that mirrored their own existence: creation followed by destruction, silence followed by renewal. When the mountains erupted, they did not see disaster alone, they saw transformation. The fire beneath the earth destroyed, but it also forged new land, rich and fertile. The Neanderthals may have sensed this long before science would explain it. They lived in harmony with that balance, never separating fear from respect. Perhaps that was their greatest insight. To them, the earth was not a resource to be taken, but a living force to be honored. They stood at the edge of molten rivers and saw not terror, but meaning. The same fire that glowed within the planet glowed within themselves. It was the bond between life and the earth's heartbeat, a reminder that all warmth comes from the same source. And when the mountains finally stilled, when the smoke drifted into the pale ice age sky, the memory of that living fire endured in their stories, passed in whispers through generations, until it reached us, echoes of the time when humans first touched the heart of the world. Across the frozen plains of prehistoric Europe, the Neanderthals built homes that defied the savagery of their environment. In a world ruled by ice and scarcity, they shaped architecture from the bones of giants. Mammoth tusks curved upward like arches of an ancient cathedral, skulls stacked in symmetry, ribs interlocked in rings that sang when the wind passed through them. These were not crude shelters thrown together in desperation. They were deliberate, mathematical, and deeply human. Archaeologists studying these bone dwellings have discovered patterns that suggest an extraordinary level of design. The circles they formed were near perfect, each structure aligned to prevailing winds, each bone placed with purpose. The great tusks, some longer than a man is tall, were bent into domes that resisted the snow's crushing weight. Layers of hide sealed the structure against the cold, and fires burned in the center, their smoke drifting through openings shaped to draw air like a chimney. What remains of these dwellings reveals not survival, but knowledge, a quiet mastery of geometry, physics, and sound. When researchers began to test the acoustics of reconstructed bone huts, they found something remarkable. Inside, the air itself seemed to hum. The circular walls reflected low frequencies that resonated in the chest, a deep, steady vibration that felt almost alive. Could it be that the Neanderthals, long before music or architecture as we know it, understood resonance? Some believe these bone structures were not only homes, but sanctuaries of sound places where firelight, breath, and rhythm converged. The mammoth bones themselves carried meaning. To build with the remains of such creatures was to command reverence. These were animals that could crush a human with a single step, yet here their bones served as the foundation of warmth and community. Perhaps the Neanderthals saw it as a cycle the beast gave its body so that life could continue. Each tusk became a prayer, each skull a reminder of the bond between hunter and hunted. In their circular homes, they lived surrounded by memory, encased in the remnants of both fear and gratitude. Some sites emit faint echoes even now. A whisper travels the inner walls like a ghost of sound, returning softer, transformed. It is easy to imagine how the Neanderthals might have felt that vibration in their bodies as they chanted or sang beside the fire. The architecture responded to them, shaping the sound, amplifying their voices into something greater. In that moment, structure and spirit became one. What they built in bone was not merely shelter, it was experience, a meeting of art, physics, and reverence. Their circles were more than homes, they were instruments of memory. Each wind that passed through those tusks played a note that still lingers in the imagination. The mammoth dwellings remind us that even in an age of hunger and frost, the Neanderthals sought beauty and survival. They lived not only to endure the ice but to create harmony within it, to hear in their fragile world the echo of something eternal, the song of the bones beneath their hands, humming softly to the rhythm of the earth. In a world without words, medicine began with observation. The Neanderthals watched the world closely, not as conquerors of nature but as its apprentices. They learned which plants burned the tongue, which soothed the stomach, which slowed the bleeding of a wound. Every lesson came at a cost. Some discoveries were born from pain, others from death. Yet over time, a pattern emerged, a language of healing, written not in ink, but in instinct and memory. Buried deep within the soil of prehistoric caves, traces of this knowledge still survive. On the teeth of Neanderthal skeletons found in El Cedrón, Spain, scientists discovered residues of yarrow and chamomile, both bitter plants with no nutritional value, but known today for their medicinal properties. Others show evidence of poplar bark, rich in salicylic acid, the natural precursor to aspirin. These were not accidents of diet. They were deliberate choices, proof that the Neanderthals could recognize illness and respond to it. In the frozen wilderness of their world, they became the first healers. They understood the earth as a living apothecary. From the mosses that grew on damp stones, they made poultices to clean wounds and draw out infection. From pine resin, they learned the power of preservation, how to seal a cut and prevent decay. Birch bark yielded tar, an early antiseptic and adhesive, its production requiring controlled heat and patience. Their knowledge extended beyond mere survival. It was the beginning of medicine, born from trial, memory, and reverence for the natural world. But not all plants were used to heal. Some were feared, spoken of only in whispers. There were herbs that brought visions, that blurred the line between waking and dream, seeds that caused trembling or stillness, barks that made the mind drift beyond the body. Archaeobotanical evidence suggests that some Neanderthal groups experimented with psychoactive plants, perhaps seeking to understand the mysteries of life and death, or to speak to what they could not see. Healing and ritual often walked the same path. To cure a sickness might also mean to appease a spirit. In the dim firelight of their shelters, healing was both science and ceremony. The healer's touch was guided not only by knowledge, but by belief. A poultice was applied with intention. A fever was treated with both herbs and words. To heal was to listen to the body, to the wind, to the unseen rhythm of the world. When pain lessened or wounds closed, it was not just skill that was credited, but connection. The Neanderthals did not separate body from spirit. They saw them as one. Over time, this knowledge became sacred. Certain herbs were guarded, their uses passed only through memory and example. Some were forbidden altogether, said to tempt the mind into madness or open doors best left closed. Yet it was through such risk that discovery thrived. Each remedy carried with it the echo of courage, the courage to reach into the wild unknown and find healing in its depths. The Neanderthals did not invent medicine as we know it. They discovered its soul. Their cures were born from the earth's whisper, from the silent dialogue between pain and persistence. They lived in a world that could kill them in a heartbeat, yet they learned to answer suffering not with despair, but with wisdom. Theirs was the first compassion written in nature's script, the moment humanity began to fight not just to live, but to heal. Long before the serpent slithered into the myths of gods and gardens, it lived in the imagination of the Neanderthals. To them, the serpent was not a creature to fear, but a symbol to revere. Its body, endlessly coiling and shedding, embodied a truth older than language, the cycle of life, death, and renewal. In the ancient world, where survival balanced on the edge of hunger and frost, the serpent became the teacher of transformation. Deep within Paleolithic caves, carvings and painted forms of winding snakes appear beside mammoths, bison, and human handprints. Some are etched into rock so subtly that they emerge only when touched by flame. Others twist around burial sites, their patterns encircling bones like guardians of passage. Archaeologists once dismissed them as coincidence, but the repetition tells another story. The Neanderthals did nothing by accident. They carved meaning where others saw only stone. The serpent's image followed them, across continents, across generations. It was a language of curves, of cycles, of hidden wisdom. The shedding of a snake's skin was unlike anything they saw in the cold and static world of ice. Here was life renewing itself before their eyes, death undone through transformation. They must have seen it as miracle, a creature reborn from its own body. To the Neanderthals, who buried their dead with care and pigment, the serpent's renewal spoke to the mystery of what came after the last breath. To die might not be to vanish, but to return. In that moment of understanding, the serpent became more than an animal. It became symbol, prophecy, promise. In one sacred site in Botswana, deep within a stone outcrop known as the Python Cave, researchers uncovered a massive rock carved with scales and grooves more than 70,000 years old. Behind it lay the traces of fire, pigment, and ritual activity. Though far from Europe, the meaning feels familiar. It suggests a continuity of thought, a belief that serpents connected the human world to forces beyond comprehension. To gaze upon the serpent was to look upon the very language of nature, coiled and eternal. Some legends whisper that a Neanderthal clan believed the serpent taught them to listen, to feel vibrations in the ground, to sense storms before they formed, to read the pulse of the earth. It was not spoken language the serpent offered, but attunement. The ability to hear the song of wind through stone, the hum of life beneath the soil. Whether myth or metaphor, this belief reveals something profound about their consciousness. They did not seek to dominate the natural world. They sought to understand it through imitation. Yet even sacred knowledge carries danger. The serpent, in its duality, represented both creation and temptation. It could heal or poison, reveal or deceive. To possess its wisdom was to walk the line between enlightenment and ruin. Perhaps that is why its image was often buried with the dead, hidden from careless eyes. Knowledge too powerful to control had to be sealed away, preserved only in ritual and memory. When the last Neanderthals vanished, the serpent remained. It slithered into the myths of those who followed, into Sumerian gods, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the gardens of later faiths. But its oldest story lies beneath the ice, carved into cave walls by hands that understood before they could speak. The Neanderthals saw in the serpent the greatest of truths, that knowledge and danger are twins, and that every renewal begins with a shedding of the old. The serpent was not their fear. It was their mirror. There comes a moment in every civilization, even one without words, when knowledge becomes too heavy to bear. For the Neanderthals, that moment arrived not through war or invention, but through silence. After generations of discovery of sound, of fire, of art, they began to sense that every gift they mastered came with a shadow. The voice could stir emotion but also summon what should remain asleep. The flame could warm but also devour. The light that had once revealed wonder now exposed fear. And so, slowly, deliberately, they began to unlearn what they once celebrated. Across the tundra, under a sky of unending cold, the clans gathered in smaller circles. Fire was kept low, its glow shielded from the wind. Words, once shared freely in chant and story, grew sparse. There were places they no longer entered, caves that had become too filled with presence. There were songs they no longer sang, tones that were said to echo longer than they should, as though the earth itself were answering back. Silence became more than absence. It became a boundary. It was respect, protection, and fear intertwined. Archaeologists studying the late Neanderthal period find fewer carvings, fewer pigments, fewer signs of ritual. It is as though a great quiet settled over their world. Perhaps the change was born of climate, or of dwindling numbers, but in that stillness, there is intention. The Neanderthals had begun to guard knowledge not because they forgot it, but because they chose to hide it. The lessons of flame, sound, and symbol had become sacred, and with sacredness came secrecy. The elders, who carried the memory of rituals long past, may have forbidden certain acts outright. Some fires were said to draw the wrong kind of attention, winds that did not blow from the north, shadows that did not belong to any living being. Certain patterns carved into stone were covered over with mud, as if to erase them from the eyes of those unready to understand. The wisdom of the past had transformed into something dangerous, a power that could unmake the fragile balance between life and the world that sustained it. Silence became their final creation. It was not ignorance, but preservation. Within it lay everything they knew: how to shape stone, how to read the stars, how to speak to the unseen, and everything they feared. The quiet was alive with memory, dense and waiting. To live in it was to live in the tension between reverence and regret. In that hush, a profound awareness took root. The Neanderthals may have sensed what humanity would take millennia to learn: that not all knowledge is meant to be spoken, and not every truth is meant to be shared. The greatest understanding sometimes requires restraint. They became the makers of silence, crafting an invisible monument to wisdom through their refusal to use it. When their kind finally faded from the earth, they left behind not only bones and tools, but a vast quiet that still lingers in the deep caves and frozen valleys where they once stood. The silence they created was not emptiness, it was legacy. A reminder that the most powerful knowledge is not the kind we proclaim, but the kind we choose to keep hidden. On a windswept plateau in the heart of ancient Europe, long before history took its first breath, a circle of stones rose from the frozen earth. They stand even now, silent and unyielding, their surfaces weathered by tens of thousands of winters. To the untrained eye, they seem like ruins of chance, just rocks on a hill. But when the moon rises, something extraordinary happens. The stones align with its ascent, each shadow falling precisely into place. Beneath their base lie bones stained with red ochre, the color of blood, the color of memory. Here, among the stones, the Neanderthals built a monument that joined heaven and earth. This place was not a village. It was not a shelter or a hunting ground. It was something else entirely, a stage for the cosmos. The precision of the alignment suggests intent, a deliberate attempt to track the movements of the sky. The Neanderthals had no telescopes, no charts, but they had time. They watched the heavens through endless nights, memorizing the slow rhythm of the stars, the return of the moon, the tilt of the seasons. In that watching, they found order amid chaos. The stones became their instruments of understanding, their first calendars, their first temples. Yet this circle was also a place of death. Excavations of similar prehistoric sites reveal human and animal bones buried together, sometimes in symmetrical arrangements, often covered in red pigment. To paint the dead was to grant them passage, to mark them as part of the eternal cycle. Blood and ochre became symbols of life continuing through death, of the body feeding the earth as the moon renewed its light. Death here was not feared. It was orchestrated, timed to the pulse of the heavens. The Neanderthals did not separate science from spirit. The study of the sky was not an act of curiosity, it was devotion. Each rising moon and returning star reaffirmed their place in the great design. Ritual and astronomy were one language. They read in the heavens the same rhythm they felt in their hearts. Birth, growth, decay, rebirth. The cosmic order mirrored their own fragile existence. But beneath the reverence was mystery, perhaps even danger. Some of the bones found within these stone circles show signs of deliberate breaking, not for violence, but for ritual. The red pigment, the careful placement, the orientation to the night sky, all point to ceremony. Were these sacrifices to appease the unknown, or acts of remembrance for those who returned to the stars? We can only guess, yet the care in every detail speaks of belief, of meaning too profound to have been random. Standing within such a circle, the Neanderthals would have seen the moon rise precisely between the stones, casting light on the earthbound bones below. In that moment, the living and the dead, the earthly and the celestial, merged into one continuum. The stars above were not distant, they were kin. This union of astronomy and mortality reveals something extraordinary about their minds. They were not merely observing the world, they were interpreting it, turning pattern into philosophy. They understood that the same forces guiding the stars also governed life and death. The circle was their equation, written not in numbers, but in stone and blood. Today, as the moon still rises over those ancient hills, the stones keep their vigil. They hold the memory of hands that once measured eternity, of eyes that sought the logic of the cosmos long before language. Beneath them, the red earth guards its secret, the first attempt by human thought to reconcile heaven with mortality. The circle endures as the Neanderthals' final question carved in silence. If death is inevitable, then perhaps meaning lies not in escaping it, but in aligning with the stars that never die. Across the cold plains of prehistory, survival was not left to chance. The Neanderthals had become more than hunters. They were strategists. Their knowledge of the land, the wind, and the behavior of animals bordered on mastery. They could predict the migration of herds, sense the shifting of seasons, and understand the delicate balance that kept prey and predator alive. But with mastery came something new: power. And with power came a shadow that would change the nature of humanity forever. Archaeological evidence from cliffs and ravines across Europe and the Near East reveals the echoes of this transformation. Layers of bones, mammoth, bison, reindeer, horse, lie crushed beneath ancient rock faces, all killed in single, organized hunts. These were not accidents of nature. They were orchestrated. The hunters had learned to drive entire herds toward natural traps, to manipulate fear and motion with sound, smoke, and fire. It was knowledge used not only to survive, but to dominate. For the first time, humans had learned to control the outcome of life and death on a massive scale. To understand such precision, one must imagine the patience it required. Generations of observation, tracking patterns across frozen centuries. They learned that animals followed stars, that rivers guided migrations, that the scent of grass carried differently in the rain. Over time, this understanding turned to strategy, and strategy turned to certainty. The hunt became not a chase, but a sentence. For the Neanderthals, it meant security, a feast after famine, the promise of warmth and full bellies. Yet beneath that triumph grew an unease, a quiet realization that power could twist as easily as it could sustain. The elders who once taught reverence for the hunt may have begun to see a difference in the younger ones. The hunt was no longer ritual, it was conquest. To command the herds was to command the future, and those who possessed this knowledge became both respected and feared. Within the clans, authority shifted. The hunters who could predict the migrations, who knew the signs written in the sky and soil, began to hold influence over the rest. What had once been shared wisdom became guarded secret. Knowledge, once sacred, became currency. This was the moment humanity crossed another unseen threshold. For in learning to bend nature's rhythm, the Neanderthals learned the possibility of control. And control, even in its smallest form, contains the seed of cruelty. When the hunt became predictable, when life could be taken without risk, the moral balance began to shift. The animals that once fed them were no longer spirits or equals, they became resources. The land itself became tool, not teacher. In that shift, something of their old world began to fade. The songs sung before the hunt quieted. The offerings once given to the fallen beasts grew fewer. They had learned too much, and in that knowing, they lost a measure of humility that had bound them to the natural world. Yet this was not evil in intent, it was evolution. Their knowledge reflected intelligence, foresight, adaptation, but it also revealed the first flicker of a truth that would define their descendants: that wisdom and exploitation are divided by the thinnest of lines. The Neanderthals may have stood at the edge of that realization, watching as their mastery turned into burden. To know too much is to hold the power to destroy, and in their cold, endless plains, they felt that truth like a shadow following every hunt. The knowledge that once kept them alive had begun to change what it meant to be alive. In the cold silence of a Siberian cave, time kept its breath for 40,000 years. Beneath layers of sediment and frost, archaeologists uncovered the small bones of a Neanderthal child, laid carefully in rest. Among the fragments of stone and soil, one object stood apart: a single amber tooth, polished to a golden sheen, placed delicately beside the jaw. It glowed faintly under the excavator's light, as if holding the warmth of a long-forgotten sun. No one knows why it was there, but in that mystery lies a story far greater than the relic itself, a story of inheritance, of memory, and of how knowledge passed through blood long before words could carry it. Amber, the fossilized sap of ancient trees, was rare and precious in the Ice Age world. It was not food, nor tool, nor weapon. To carve it required patience and understanding of material that responded to touch more like flesh than stone. Its golden color, captured light from a dying world of glaciers and fire, must have held deep meaning. For the Neanderthals, who buried their dead with care and purpose, the amber tooth was no decoration. It was a message. Some scientists believe it was a charm, an offering to guide the child into whatever lay beyond life. Others suggest it symbolized lineage, a marker of connection between the living and the departed. But perhaps it was more profound than that. Perhaps the tooth represented inheritance not of bloodline alone, but of wisdom, an acknowledgement that memory itself was sacred. The Neanderthals understood that survival was more than endurance, it was continuity. Each child was a vessel carrying the knowledge of those who came before. The amber tooth might have belonged to an ancestor, passed down like a relic, polished by generations of hands until it gleamed. If so, it was not merely an object, it was legacy incarnate. The material itself held meaning. Amber preserved what once lived. Within its glow, ancient insects remained suspended for eternity, frozen moments of life that refused decay. The Neanderthals may have seen in that permanence a reflection of their own longing to hold memory beyond death, to resist the erasure that time demands. In a sense, that small golden relic represents one of the first gestures of philosophy. It shows that the Neanderthals were not content to live only in the present. They looked backward and forward, connecting the unseen threads between generations. The burial of the child suggests ritual, but beneath ritual lies thought. They believed that life, even brief and fragile, mattered enough to preserve in symbol. In that belief, we find the spark of something unmistakably human. When the ice finally swallowed their world, the amber tooth remained. Its glow, trapped beneath the earth for millennia, outlasted their bodies, their language, their species. Yet through it, they still speak. The Neanderthals may have vanished, but they left behind this quiet testament that knowledge is not measured in tools or power, but in remembrance. The child with the golden tooth was not buried in grief alone, but in reverence for the idea that even a short life could carry the fire of an entire people. The amber did not preserve the child. It preserved the meaning of being remembered. The world began to darken again. The sun, once a faithful companion over the tundra, grew faint behind a veil of ash and cloud. Volcanoes erupted across continents, their smoke drifting for years through the upper air, dimming the light that fed the land. The ice advanced southward, swallowing forests, rivers, and valleys. For the Neanderthals, this was the return of the storm, years a time when the world itself seemed to draw its final breath. The temperatures plummeted. Herds that once roamed in abundance vanished into silence, driven north, or perished beneath the endless frost. The plants they gathered shriveled, and even the great hunters, the mammoths and bison, grew scarce. The air turned sharp enough to cut the lungs. What little fire they could kindle had to be guarded like life itself. Their shelters became sanctuaries of breath and shadow, the last outposts of warmth in a dying world. It was in this crucible of desperation that memory began to transform. The elders who once taught by example now spoke in whispers around dimming embers. They told of days when the sun was strong, when spirits of earth and sky walked among the living. They spoke of the mountains that bled fire, of rivers that glowed in the night, of stars that fell and became stone. These stories, born of remembrance, became something new. They became myth. For the first time, wisdom was not passed as instruction, but as story. It was no longer enough to explain how to survive. They needed to remember why. Around the last fires of the storm years, imagination became a tool of endurance. The Neanderthals began to weave their knowledge into tales, songs of gods, of fire, of serpents, of ancestors who whispered through the wind. In the darkness, words became bridges between the known and the unknowable. Archaeological layers from this period reveal fewer tools, fewer signs of construction. It was as if their energy had turned inward, from crafting the material world to preserving the unseen one. The red pigments and carvings that once adorned the caves now served a different purpose. They became symbols, talismans against despair. The handprint on the wall was not just a mark of presence, it was defiance, a silent promise that something of them would endure beyond the storm. The earth itself seemed to mourn. Glaciers ground their way across the continents, reshaping everything in their path. The air grew still, and snow fell in endless silence. In that silence, the Neanderthals turned to what remained: fire, story, and one another. They sang songs forbidden in gentler times, songs of the fire beneath the earth, of the serpent who taught them language, of the stars that once guided their hunts. What had once been science and ritual became legend. Knowledge, too fragile to survive in form, took refuge in myth. When the storms finally eased, when the world began to thaw again, the Neanderthals were fewer. Some had vanished entirely, yet the stories endured. They would echo across the generations that followed, carried unknowingly into the myths of the first Homo sapiens who wandered these same lands. The storm years had turned knowledge into memory, memory into faith, and faith into survival. In the end, the Neanderthals did not disappear because they were weak. They became part of the world's oldest truth, that wisdom, when faced with extinction, transforms into story so that it may never truly die. In the final twilight of the Neanderthals, the world was unraveling. The forests thinned beneath the weight of snow, rivers turned to glass, and the herds that had once thundered across the plains became specters on the horizon. Entire clans vanished into the white silence, their fires extinguished one by one. Yet in a remote valley, where the wind still carried the scent of smoke, a single flame endured. It flickered in the hands of a woman, the last firekeeper. Archaeological evidence hints at these final centuries, when Neanderthals clung to survival as their numbers dwindled. Tools grew simpler, settlements smaller. But fire remained constant, their oldest companion and their last defense against extinction. The woman who tended it represented more than survival. She embodied memory. In every spark, she carried the story of her people, how they first learned to coax flame from stone, how they used it to light the dark, cook the flesh of mammoth, and temper the edges of their tools. To her, the fire was not just heat, it was inheritance. Her world was collapsing, but she guarded the secret of the flame as though it were the pulse of life itself. Each morning she fed it with dry moss, whispering to it as she worked. To lose it meant more than death. It meant forgetting. Fire had become the bridge between what was and what would come next, and in her care it burned not only for her kind but for those who would follow. It is here, in the final intersection of species, that the story of inheritance takes a new shape. Genetic evidence tells us that humans and Neanderthals met, mingled, and shared more than blood. They shared ideas, tools, and perhaps around the edge of some ancient clearing the secret of fire itself. The image of a Neanderthal woman passing a glowing ember to a human child may never be proven, but the symbolism endures. It represents the transfer of knowledge from one world to another, from a species fading into the dark to one stepping into the light. When we trace the spread of controlled fire across the continents, we find echoes of her memory. The methods, the materials, the patience they bear her mark. Every hearth, every torch that burned through the millennia is an unbroken chain reaching back to her hands. Through her, the ancient wisdom of flame crossed the boundary between extinction and survival. In the quiet after her kind was gone, the human child's descendants carried that knowledge forward. They built greater fires, brighter ones, until flame filled their temples and cities. They forgot her name, forgot her people, but not the warmth she left behind. The last firekeeper may never have known the scale of her gift. She did not save her species, but she preserved its soul. In teaching another how to keep the flame alive, she ensured that something of the Neanderthals would burn forever in every campfire, every hearth, every spark struck against stone. The fire that once lit her face beneath a dying sky did not end in ash. It became the light of all who came after. There comes a moment in every story when silence becomes the only narrator. For the Neanderthals, that moment arrived beneath a dimming sky at the end of the last ice age. The world that had shaped them for hundreds of thousands of years was changing beyond recognition. Forests crept where tundra once ruled. Rivers cut new paths through the earth, and the animals that had sustained them began to move farther north or disappear altogether. The balance between life and extinction hung by a thread. Then, without warning or farewell, the thread snapped. The Neanderthals, our closest kin, vanished from the earth. Yet extinction is never as final as it seems. Though their voices fell silent, something of them endured, carried not in words or monuments, but in echoes. For generations after their disappearance, humans told stories of beings who lived before them, giants of strength and mystery, keepers of fire, dwellers in the caves of the gods. Their memory lingered in myth, their rituals recast as superstition. What had once been sacred knowledge slowly unraveled into fragments scattered through time. The archaeological record shows how swiftly their world faded. The red ochre that once painted their dead, the carvings etched with purpose, the tools shaped by skilled hands, all vanished within a few centuries. In their place appeared human settlements, filled with symbols and songs of their own. But if one listens closely, traces of the Neanderthal mind remain beneath the surface of human culture. The fear of darkness, the reverence for caves, the belief that spirits dwell within the earth all echo the worldview of those who came before. The line between remembrance and forgetting is thinner than we imagine. Perhaps the greatest tragedy was not their extinction, but their erasure. The Neanderthals left no written record to defend themselves against time's indifference. Their wisdom, how to read the sky, how to speak through sound, how to heal with plants, was absorbed by those who survived, reshaped until it no longer resembled its origin. A fire once tended with reverence became a ritual offering. A song once sung for the dead became a prayer for the unknown. The science of survival transformed into the poetry of fear. And so began what could only be called the night of forgetting. As humans spread across continents, They carried fragments of Neanderthal knowledge like embers hidden in ash. Over centuries, those embers cooled, their meaning lost. The myths that followed of ancient giants, of watchers in the mountains, of spirits whispering in the wind, were faint memories of a species that had lived and thought before us. Even the shape of our legends bears their mark. The monsters and gods of the old world may not be inventions at all, but distortions of memory, shadows of those who once shared our fires. But forgetting is not complete. In our bones, in our DNA, they remain. Every human alive today carries traces of their blood, fragments of their story. The Neanderthals are not gone. They are written into us. The curve of a skull, the strength of a hand, the spark of curiosity, they linger, silent and enduring. The night of forgetting was not the end. It was transformation. Their story became ours, hidden within the folds of time until science, millennia later, began to remember what myth had only hinted at. The last Neanderthal did not die alone. She left her memory in the marrow of her descendants, her voice folded into the whisper of the human genome. The stories that once belonged to her kind became the foundation of our own, the dreams of the first storytellers who looked at the stars and felt something ancient stir within them. The night of forgetting was not silence at all. It was the long, patient breath before memory returned. Tens of thousands of years after the last Neanderthal fire went cold, the earth began to give them back. In riverbanks, caves, and layers of ancient soil, their bones began to surface fragments of skulls, ribs, and hands that once shaped stone, painted walls, and touched flame. At first, they were dismissed as brutish remnants, relics of a lesser kind of human. But as the dirt was brushed away, a deeper truth emerged. These bones did not just speak of survival. They spoke of intention, of care, of a species that felt, thought, and remembered. The Neanderthals had not been beasts. They had been us. Archaeologists kneeling over those remains began to see patterns that could not be explained by chance. Bodies carefully arranged, skulls dusted with red ochre, flowers placed near the dead pollen still trapped in the soil around their bones. Each gesture revealed empathy, the ability to see beyond death and to feel the weight of loss. In one grave, a Neanderthal child was found cradled in the curve of an elder's arm, both dusted with pigment. In another, an injured hunter whose wounds had long since healed, proof that others must have cared for him through his pain. These were not the acts of savages. They were acts of love. Even their tools bear silent testimony to thought and foresight. Scrapers sharpened along predictable edges, blades refined to near perfection, pigments mixed with precision. Every artifact shows repetition. Not instinct, but teaching knowledge passed through generations. This was culture, transmitted not by words but by demonstration and memory. When they shaped stone, they were shaping identity. When they buried their dead, they were shaping meaning. And in the bones themselves, science uncovered another layer of story. Within their marrow lies the record of their lives, what they ate, where they traveled, what they endured. Traces of smoke in their lungs reveal the presence of hearths. Patterns in their teeth show seasons of hunger and abundance. Chemical signatures in their bones trace migrations that spanned entire continents. The Neanderthals were not trapped by the ice. They moved through it, adapted to it, thrived in its rhythm. They read the landscape with an intelligence carved from experience, their every decision guided by an understanding that we are only now beginning to grasp. But the bones do more than reveal behavior. They reveal connection. In their DNA, we find the unmistakable proof that they are part of us. The fragments recovered from caves in Spain, Croatia, and Siberia have rewritten the story of humanity. Between 1 and 4% of the genetic code in every person outside Africa comes from them. Their blood still flows in ours, Their traits echo in our skin, our immune systems, even the structure of our minds. The bones that once slept beneath the frost remember for us what we had forgotten, that humanity is not a single story, but a shared inheritance. To hold a Neanderthal bone is to touch time itself, to feel the bridge between what we were and what we became. The pigment that once colored their rituals still glows faintly in the dust, a reminder that beauty was not born with civilization, it existed in the hearts of those who lived and died before us. The bones that remember are not silent. They speak of tenderness, courage, and continuity. They remind us that intelligence is not only measured by invention, but by compassion. In their buried hands, we find the first evidence of something eternal: the human need to remember, to honor, and to leave behind a trace of light in the dark. In the end, their story did not end with extinction. The Neanderthals vanished from the surface of the world, but not from its memory. The earth closed over their bones. The winds scattered their ashes, and time buried their fires beneath layers of silence. Yet, unseen, their greatest legacy endured. It was not carved into stone, nor painted on cave walls. It was written in something far more enduring, in the code of life itself. Their knowledge, their instincts, their fears, and their triumphs were folded into the blood of those who came after. They did not disappear. They became part of us. When scientists first mapped the human genome, they found ghosts hidden within it. Traces of Neanderthal DNA, fragments of ancient inheritance woven through the double helix of modern humanity. At first it seemed a curiosity, a biological footnote. But with every discovery, the truth deepened. Their genetic legacy shaped our immune systems, our skin, even the architecture of our minds. The Neanderthal lives not as fossil or myth, but as pulse, as presence. Each heartbeat carries the memory of a world older than civilization, older than history itself. That realization changes everything. It tells us that we were never the beginning, only the continuation. The knowledge they earned through fire and hardship, the understanding of stone, of plant, of pain did not vanish with their last breath. It passed quietly into the bloodstream of humanity, carried forward through the ages. The reflex to nurture, the fear of darkness, the fascination with flame, all echo their ancient lives. When we stand before the night sky and feel awe at its vastness, it is not only our wonder, it is theirs. The same eyes once gazed upward through icy clouds and saw meaning in the movement of stars. We have spent centuries calling them primitive, but perhaps they were only quieter, wiser, in ways we have forgotten. They did not build empires or write scriptures. They left no monuments that reached for heaven, only small, perfect acts of remembrance. A flower placed beside the dead, a circle of stones aligned with the moon, a child buried with a golden tooth. They understood something we have long struggled to remember: that survival alone is not greatness, that knowledge is sacred only when tempered by reverence. The blood that flows through us now carries their story. It is a living archive, older than any language, deeper than any memory. Within it lies their resilience, their tenderness, their unspoken wisdom. We are the vessel of what they learned and what they lost. The fire that once burned in their hands still burns in ours, brighter and more dangerous than ever. The same curiosity that taught them to command flame now drives us to command the stars. And as we look beyond our world, we repeat their oldest act: the reaching, the questioning, the need to know what cannot yet be known. Perhaps that is the hidden warning they left us. The knowledge humans were never meant to have was never a secret buried in the earth, but a truth buried in ourselves. It is the understanding that every discovery carries a cost, and that every spark of brilliance casts a shadow. In our veins runs the echo of a vanished people who once dreamed, who once feared, who once lit a fire against the darkness. Their story ends where ours begins. The Neanderthals are gone, yet they endure in our bodies, in our dreams, in the restless hunger of our minds. We are their memory made flesh, their fire reborn. The knowledge did not die, it became us.